Good morning and welcome to Connect. If you're new here, I want to give you a special welcome. My name is Scott Engelman. I'm the president of Awaken Heart. I think we've been around for about 20 years or so. Our office is down in the first floor, 148. And our commitment is to give men hope and direction in a confusing world through the Lord Jesus Christ. And our purpose this morning is to give hope and direction through biblical teaching. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. Where we're going, Mark shared, is we're going to be in session number 2 of our series, What is a Man? The most important question a man not should answer, but must answer. We have to answer this question, guys. Now, the purpose of the series, why we're sharing this, is to challenge men, to challenge you and me as men, to accept our responsibility before God to become the men God created and calls us to be. That's our purpose for this series, that we would accept the responsibility that God has given us to be men. Now, why this? Well, one reason. The world is falling apart, isn't it? And it's falling apart for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is it's falling apart because the world was made to need men. God created the world and He put men in the world to continue to shape it and form it and tame it and develop it into a place where people can thrive. And to do that, He made us as men to be men with moral character, to be men of moral clarity, to be men of moral courage, and to be men with moral resolve. And guys, we lack that in our men today. The world is falling apart because it doesn't have those kind of men. The world needs men to speak into the moral chaos of our day in the same way that the prophet Isaiah did in his day. You may be familiar with this passage, Isaiah 5:20. It says, "Woe to you who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." You know, you don't have to look at very much news or be around very much to see that this is exactly what's going on today, isn't it? We live in a culture that is morally corrupt and decaying, that calls evil good and good evil, that says this is light when it's darkness, and it says this is darkness when it's light. For example, moral clarity translated into our day, in other words, something that Isaiah we may hear him say if he was living today, might be something like this: there are only 2 genders. That's moral clarity. Moral clarity says gender is only recognized at birth, not assigned. Men cannot become women or women become men. That's moral clarity. Moral clarity says a trans woman is not a woman, only a disfigured man. Marriage is between a man and a woman, not between a woman and a woman and a man and a man. As Doug Wilson says, that's not marriage, that's a mirage. Abortion is the state-sanctioned murder of a human being. Moral clarity says fathers are necessary in the home. They're not just a nice option. It says that parents have authority over their kids, not the state or the school. Kids at drag queen events are being sexually groomed and abused. There is neither your truth or my truth, only the truth. The actions of Hamas and Israel are not morally equivalent actions. Moral clarity says speaking with moral clarity is not hate speech nor any other cultural sin. Guys, we need those kind of men with moral clarity, who speak into the moral courage or moral chaos with moral courage. And they continue to do it with moral resolve. But if that's the kind of man you are, or you want to be, and that's the kind of men the world needs, then beware of this. Our culture will vilify any man who speaks and acts with moral clarity and moral courage. It will. You can't convince the culture to believe what you believe when it comes to moral clarity. For example, you may remember this. On May 1st, 2023, there was a young man who risked his safety, remember that, to protect fellow subway riders in New York City from the violence that was being threatened to all of them by another young man. Now, both young men exercise masculine strength. One to threaten life, the other one to what? Preserve life. Which one was morally vilified by the culture? Remember? The young man with moral clarity and moral courage. In fact, I heard just yesterday he's facing a possibility of 19 years in prison. Men who speak with moral clarity, men who move into the culture with moral courage, they will be vilified by the culture. And Jesus said in Matthew 5, when they accuse you of evil and all sorts of things because of me, don't be surprised, because that's going to happen, but instead rejoice. So with all that in mind, in a world that's lacking moral clarity and needs men with moral clarity, where are we going in this series? Well, we're going to take this in three parts. Number one, we're going to look in terms of what is a man. We're going to look at our original design. And we're going to ask the question here, what are men for? What are men for? What are you for as a man? What am I for as a man? Then secondly, we're going to look at our current state. We're going to ask the question here, why do men struggle? And then thirdly, we're going to look at our larger hope as men. And we're going to ask the question, can a man really change? Can you really change as a man? And when we look at our original design, ask the question, what are men for? We're going to see that men are built to bless, and we're going to see this because out of the creation story. We're going to go back to Genesis 1 and 2 and look at what the Bible says about our origin as a man. And then when we ask the question, why do men struggle, and consider our current state, we're going to see that men internally are all confused and afraid. Why? Because of the story of the fall. It affects all men the same. It manifests itself in different ways, but it produces in men a certain confusion and a certain fear. And then when we look at our larger hope and we ask the question, can men really change? We're going to see, yes, it is possible. Men can be changed as they begin to have their design restored. And here we're going to look at the story of the gospel, which is more than just a story about going to heaven when you die. It's the story of heaven coming back to earth and God making all things new, including who we are as men made in His image. Now, if you were here last time, you might remember that we looked at the foundations of manhood. If we're going to understand manhood, we've got to understand that there's a foundation that we build that on. And we said that there are two different kinds of foundations that will shape our answer of how we answer the question, what is a man? Remember that? The two foundations. The first one is the foundation of the secular culture. And the secular culture tells us that your identity, your personal identity, has nothing to do with your biological male body. Why? Because it says that you are not your body. It says that your body, your male body, is toxic. It tells us that our male body is only temporary. You're here today and gone tomorrow. And it says that your male body is just an accident. It's just a product of evolution. So it has no purpose, no meaning, nothing sacred or valuable to it. Contrast that with the biblical theology foundation, which the Bible tells us that God's design of your male body informs your masculine identity. In other words, when you look at your body, you can get an idea of what it means to be a man. God shaped and formed your body in concord with your masculine identity.
Hey Scott, I'm sorry. Can you unmute the microphone for in here?
Where is that?
That's,
Are you guys having a hard time hearing me?
yeah, we're going to put a mic on you for in here.
Okay. Oh, you never gave me that one.
Yeah. So we'll just do it.
While Steve's doing that, let's continue. The Bible says you are your body. You have a soul, but you also have a body, and it's not that you are a soul contained in a body, but you are a body and soul combined. You're an embodied soul. You're an ensouled body. Then we saw that your body is good. Remember, God made man in his image in Genesis 1 and 2, and God said it was what? Good. It was good. And your male body is forever. It's not just here today and gone tomorrow. And why do we know that? Because someday God is going to resurrect, not your spirit. Your spirit, when you die, your spirit or your soul goes to be with Jesus, but your body goes in the ground. But that's subhuman, because to be fully human is an embodied soul. So God is going to raise not just your body, but your male body. It's forever. And why is it forever? Well, one reason, because your male body is sacred. 1 Corinthians 6 says it was made not for you, not for sexual immorality. It was made for who? The Lord, and for His purposes. And so what we said last time is how we answer the question, what is a man, will be shaped by the foundation we build our life on. The secular foundation will give you one answer for what it means to be a man, and the biblical foundation will give you a completely different answer. If you weren't here last time, you can go back, you can go and see what we talked about on our YouTube channel. So today, what we want to do, we want to build on all of this by just kind of launching, springboarding into another question. Another question that our culture is struggling to ask. In fact, it's more of a more well-known question than the question, what is a man? Can you get it? What is a woman? Yeah. And in Matt Walsh's book, What is a Woman? These are some of the answers that in interviewing people that he came up with. He asked people, what is a woman? And some of the answers were, I don't know how to answer that. Another one was, I can't answer that, I'm not a biologist. Another one was, anyone who identifies as a woman is a woman. Another one, someone that likes to be pretty and think of themselves as delicate. Anybody here that think of themselves as pretty and delicate? Well, if so, then you're in the wrong group, okay? Because this is a men's group. Not saying men can't be pretty or men can't be delicate, but if that's how you think of yourself, don't think of yourself as a woman, okay? And only people who are women can know what a woman is. That's like saying only people who've had heart attacks can know what a heart attack is. I've never had a heart attack, but I know what they're like. I can tell you what a heart attack is. Now, with all this kind of crazy, strange answers, we come up with things like pregnant men and women with penises. And you have the tuck bathing suits. I mean, all this moral confusion and moral chaos. We need men with moral clarity and men with moral courage who can say, there are no such thing as pregnant men. And women do not have penises. But instead, too often, we are just silent and say nothing. So what's my thesis this morning? Well, while what is a woman is an important question, it's not the first question that you and I should be asking. What's the first question? What is a man? That's the question that's more important. And it's more important not just for men, but it's more important for humanity. Why? Well, not because men are superior than women or men are more important than women. We see in the Bible that men and women are created to image God equally, but to reflect Him differently. Then why is this, what is a man, the more important question? Well, because of our theology of the body. Remember, if we go back to the creation story, what was the woman created from? Remember? She was created from who? The flesh of the man, and the man was created from the dirt of the ground. Now, if the woman was created from the man because the man didn't have someone that corresponded to him like the animals had, so God makes him go to sleep, He creates the woman from His flesh, and then He presents to the man the woman. And remember how the man describes the woman. What does he declare when he sees the woman? This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. What's that? Just another way of saying she's identified with me. From who does the woman derive her identity? From the man. And if that's true, and I believe it is based on a biblical theology of the body, you see why that's so important? If that's true, then to rightly answer the woman question, we must first answer the man question. So while everybody is asking what is a woman, the more important question that we need to answer first, not a matter of superiority, but a matter of ontology, is what? What is a man? And so if we're going to answer that question, we want to look at the Scriptures. And we want to look at the Scriptures because we believe the Scriptures are our source of authority that tells us about life, what life is, what it's supposed to be about, what's wrong with it, and how life can be repaired. And so we're going to the Scriptures to answer that question. And the key passage that we're going to build on is 1 Corinthians 16:13. And this is what it says. Be on guard, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Be on guard, stand firm in the faith, act like what? Men, be strong. Now I want to make an observation from the text. The phrase, act like men, lexically that could be translated, be manly, or it could also be translated, be men of courage. Now, lexically, act like men, be manly, be men of courage. That's all the way of saying it. But grammatically, I want you to notice something. Grammatically, in the Greek, which the New Testament was written in, where this comes from, this is an imperative. And anybody remember your English grammar, what an imperative is? An imperative is a command. In other words, we are commanded to act like men in this world. It's not just a nice idea. It's not just a suggestion. Hey, if you could do this, this would be nice. This is God commanding you and me to do what? To act like men. To be manly. To be men of courage in this morally corrupt and chaotic world. In other words, acting like men is what God requires of you and me. Acting like men is what He requires of you and me. Now, notice, this Greek imperative has a logical assumption behind it. And what's that assumption? The assumption is this: the command presupposes a recognized standard. In other words, there's a way to act like a man, and there are ways what? Not to act like a man. And there is a standard that we are expected or to know in order to do what? To be obedient to the You can't be obedient to a command that you don't understand what's the standard of behind the command. So here's the command, act like men, but it assumes that there is a standard of masculinity that we should know so that we can measure our level of obedience to that. Right? So here's the question. If God commands us to act like men, then there must exist a standard to measure our obedience, right? And here's the question. What is that standard, and where does it come from? What does it mean to be a man? Not just what I think, but what God tells us masculinity is. We're going to answer that question in 5 minutes. We're going to come back from our break, okay? Prior to the break, we looked at the key text that we are going to be kind of camping out on when it comes to answering our question, what is a man? From 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13. And we said lexically it can be translated act like a man or act like men. Or it could also be equally translated be manly. Or it could equally be translated be men of courage. And we said that this phrase, act like men, is in the Greek text an imperative, it's command. And what we said is that God commands us to act like men in this world, that we are in this world, He placed us in this world, and He made us men, and now He says, act like the men I created you to be. And it's what God requires of you and me. He requires men to be men. And we said that if He requires us to be men, if He's commanding you and me to be men, then there must be a standard. It only logically makes sense that there's a standard to which we must look so that we can know the measure of our obedience to God when it comes to acting like men or being men of courage. And so the command presupposes a already recognized standard. We're not creating this standard. The standard is already there. We just got to fall in line with it. But before we can fall in line with it, we first must what? Know what that standard is. Because there are ways to act like men and there are ways not to act like men. And so then we concluded with the question, if God commands us to act like men, then there must exist a standard to measure that obedience. So then what is that standard and where can we find it? I want to be a man, I want to be obedient to the command that God gives us, but what does it look like to be a man? And where can I find that standard that tells me what that looks like? And what we're going to say over the next several months is that it can be found through a careful study of the Bible. Remember I said that I use the Bible because the Bible is the source of authority that we as Christians use to make sense of life, to make sense of why we're here, what's wrong in the world, and how what's wrong in the world can be solved. There's a lot of different sources of authority that are telling us, or giving different answers to those things, but we as Christians are committed to using the Bible as our source of authority. So when we ask the question, what is a man, and we say there must be a standard behind that, where is that standard found? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to go to our source of authority and say, what does the Bible tell us that standard is? And therefore, we can answer the question, what does it mean to be a man? So, we're going to look at the Bible. But when you read the Bible, you just don't pick it up and you just, read here and there and make it say what you want it to say. There are specific rules of studying the Bible like you study any good literature. There are ways to interpret it, there are ways not to interpret it. But one of the key rules of Bible study when you read the Bible is this. Always remember this. While the Bible was written for us, it was not written to us. It was written, when it says, act like men, that was written for us. God wants us as men in this generation, as in previous generations, as in future generations. He wants us to act like men, and we learn that from the Bible. So it was written for us, but the Bible was not written to us. Who was 1 Corinthians 16:13 written to? It was written for us, act like men, but it wasn't written to us. Who was it written to? Well, it was written to first century Christian men by a first century Christian man. That man was named Paul, and Paul wrote this letter to a bunch of Jewish and Gentile Christians in a city called Corinth, over in the Greece area. And so it was written to them. They were the original readers. When Paul wrote this, he had these readers in mind. So while they were the original readers, it was written to them. We benefit from what Paul wrote to these first century Christians because we follow in their footsteps in our desire to know and serve Christ and honor God. Does that make sense? So the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. Now, why is that important to note? Well, first century Christian men were shaped by a culture that is very different than the culture you and I have been shaped by. We're all shaped by the culture that we live in to a certain extent. You know, we live and breathe in ways that the culture thinks and sees life and understands life, and we just absorb it. We breathe it all in, and that culture shapes us. Well, it's no different for us today than for them back then than it is for us today. Just as our culture shaped us, so their culture shaped them. As a result, they viewed in the first century, those Christian men in the first century, viewed the world and everything in it very differently than we as 21st century Christian men view it today. Which means that when they, the original readers to whom it was written, heard the command, act like men, they would have heard it very differently than we hear it today. How they heard act like men would take on a whole different way of thinking than how we hear it. Why? Because we're shaped by two different cultures. The culture that shaped their view of manhood is different from the culture that shaped ours. For example, how did first century Christian men hear the biblical command to act like men? Let me give you an idea. They heard it from a God-centered point of view. God, in their culture, where they lived as Christian men in that era, God was the point of everything, and everything that there is exists for Him. God is the point, and everything that you see and everything that there is, including me and you, exists for Him. So they heard it from a God-centered point of view, but it was framed within the biblical story of creation. And in the biblical story of creation, they believe that God determines everything, or put another way, God says how the world works. We only discover how God says it works. He determines what is right, He determines what is wrong, He determines what is up, He determines what is down. He determines everything. Why? Because He is the point. Everything exists for Him. They would have also heard it with male and female image bearers as key to God's plan. See, when they looked at the creation story doesn't just talk about men and women, it talks about men and women created in the image of God. And that would have caught their attention, that men and women are male and female image bearers, and male and female image bearers are key to God's plan for the world. Men and women reflect God equally but differently. We represent God equally as image bearers, but how we represent Him will manifest itself differently. Finally, they would have heard it with special interest in God's purpose for men. Why? Because they were men. And Paul says, act like men, and so they go back to the creation story and the story of male and female image bearers, and they say, what did it look like back then to be a man? And what they saw was that manhood has certain responsibilities. They would have seen that God gave to men a mission to accomplish that was different than a woman's. Okay? So all this would have been in their mind when they heard act like men. They would have heard it from a God-centered point of view, framed within the biblical creation story, and then within the biblical creation story, they would have focused on male and female image bearers as key to God's plan for the world. And they would have had a special interest in what it meant to be a man. Why? Because they were men, and they wanted to know what it meant to be a man, how to act like men in God's world. All that would have been there when they heard this command. Now contrast that with our culture. Our view of manhood has been shaped by a culture very different than theirs. For example, we have been shaped by a culture that is not God-centered, but is what? Man-centered. Man is the point, not God, and I exist for myself. I don't exist for God, I exist for myself. And if there is a God, guess what? He exists for me. Not only that, but we have been shaped by a culture that is framed not within the story of creation, but within the story of evolution. And what does evolution say? It doesn't say God is behind everything, it says what? Nothing is behind everything. Which means that life has no purpose, life has no meaning, it has no shape, it has no truth, it has nothing. It's just an accident. And we've been shaped by a culture that says that in this story of evolution, there are humans that exist that are more fully evolved, that are animals that are more fully evolved than other animals. In other words, there's nothing special about humans, they're just more fully evolved animals. And because the man somehow has a little bit more power and strength, and he was out there doing all kinds of things, protecting him from dinosaurs, he began to use that power to think that he was superior and to be oppressive, so that he began to think that women were inferior. So now what do we got to do out of this way of thinking? Well, we got to make sure we understand that women are equal to men. And God already says they are, but evolution says, by the way, men and women are different, that they're not. And if men and women are then to be equal, then equality requires androgyny. What does that mean? There can be no differences between men and women. Because if there are differences, then one must be superior and one must be inferior. And if there are differences, then we know what that's going to mean because of evolution. Men, because of strength, survival of the fittest and all that, men are going to be superior. And again, I'm not saying that, but that's the conclusions of evolution. And so to get away from that, we have to say that no, women are just as equal to men. But to say that then requires that we have to say there are no differences. And by the way, as we saw last time, that's one of the reasons given for abortion. Why? Because men have an unfair advantage in sex. because they can go and have sex without consequences. Women have sex and there are consequences, pregnancy. So if men and women are going to be equal, then women need to what? Be able to have an abortion. Sex without consequences. And then finally, because of the story of evolution, and I'm the point, and humans are more fully evolved animals than others, and we gotta bring equality through androgyny. The focus then is on taming a man's primal aggressive nature, the thing that makes him quote unquote superior in the evolutionary way of thinking. We gotta not only lift women up, but we gotta do what? Tame men, we gotta bring them down. So why? Because masculinity is now uncivilized. That's just for cavemen. Survival of the fittest, while it worked years and years and years ago, guess what? It has become outdated. So women have to become masculinized and men have to become what? Feminized, so that we're all equal and there are no differences. In other words, what I'm saying is this: our view of manhood is derived from a culture that has been largely shaped by secular evolutionary story, not a divine creation story. And even though you and I, as Christians, may say we believe in the creation story, because we breathe and swim in this culture, this evolutionary culture, guess what gets absorbed into our thinking without even realizing it? This whole culture and the cultural way of seeing life, of seeing the world, of seeing people, of seeing men. And that then plays a part into how we answer the question, what is a man? But additionally, there are also 5 other cultural strands that work to form our definition of manhood. First of all is our family culture. We all grow up in a culture where manhood was viewed in a certain way. If your dad was strong and domineering, then manhood was viewed in a certain way there. If he was not in the home, then manhood was viewed in a certain way. Your family of origin and then your parents and grandparents and all the way, they form a way of thinking about men. And guess what? We begin to, like a sponge, just absorb that and begin to think about ourselves as men like that. Not only that, we live in an American culture that says men are to be tough. But we also live in a church culture that says, no, not tough men, you know, it's more to be a nice guy. We've got to take the rough edges off of John Wayne, and so that we can be a nice guy. But we also live in a culture that is a progressive culture that says, no, men are not tough men or nice guys, they're expressive persons. You know, it's just who you are and what you want to be, that's more important. And then we live in a woke culture that says, no, men are toxic oppressors. There's nothing good about men. As I said from that book last time, it talked about just as there's no healthy cancer, there's no healthy masculinity. Masculinity is bad. It's from the Stone Age, and we gotta smash it and cut it out. Why? Because it's toxic and oppressive. And so what I'm saying is that we all are affected by these cultures, and it's all undergirded by an evolutionary secular culture. And so we mix all this together. And guess what? We don't even realize it. Now here's my question. What will happen if we hear act like men, the command act like men, through a synthesis of these 5 cultural strains that are all undergirded by secular evolution? What will happen? Well, what will happen is we'll have a faulty biblical standard for manhood. We'll think that this is what it means to be a man, and it's not. And if we have a faulty understanding of manhood, what will happen to the command? will misapply God's command to be manly. You see that? So it's so important then that we understand the standard is going to be shaped by the culture that we have come to live in. So what does this mean for a world in need of good men? What it means for you and I, as we go back to that rule of Bible study, is we must learn to hear the command just as the first century Christian men heard it. Why? Because what's the rule of the Bible study? The Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. It was written to first century Christian men who heard it framed in the creation story, which became the source then of their manly standard, which then became the basis for what? Acting like a man. In other words, the command asks the question, what does it mean? The standard tells us. And where do we find the standard? Back to the creation story. So it all goes back, where? To Genesis 1 and 2. Now, why do we need to do this again? Well, because the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. It was written to men that were steeped in the story of creation. That's how Paul understood it, who wrote it, and that's how these first century Christian men heard it. And what I'm saying is the standard that they were thinking about came out of the creation story. Not American culture, not my family culture, not my church culture, not the progressive culture, not the woke culture, not the evolutionary culture. It came out of a culture steeped in the story of creation that said God is the point of everything. And He made men for His purposes, and He made men to accomplish His mission, and He calls men and He requires men to be the men He created them to be. Now, before we close, I want to give you a preview of where we're going to be going. If we're going to be going back to the creation story, next time we're going to focus back there. But before we go there, let me just give you a preview, and then just what we can kind of take from that preview, and then end up with a definition of what it means to be a man that we're going to then unpack in the days to come. So, here's the story of creation. There are six points of it when it's focused on what it means to be a man, okay? First of all, God, in Genesis 1 and 2, we learn that God is the good and sovereign creator of the world and everything in it. Without God, there would be no life. Without God, there would be no world. Without God, there would be no human beings. Without God, there would be no you or no me. God is the good and sovereign creator of the world and everything in it. And because He is the creator, the Psalms tell us He owns His creation. He has say in His creation. Second, God, it tells us, as the sovereign creator, formed the man out of the ground to be a dependent, loving, worshiping creature with free choice. Man didn't evolve. God reached down into the ground. We are dirt creatures. And He breathed and He spoke and we became a living being. And as a living being, we are dependent. We're not self-sufficient. Everything that we do, from breathing to eating, everything depends on God. Because where does our breath come from? Where does our food come from? Where does everything in life come from? we are ultimately dependent on God, and God made us to know that. And He made us to love Him. We're relational beings. He made us to love Him and to worship Him, to be grateful for who He is and His goodness and His care and His provision. But He also made us with free choice, because God didn't want puppets. God wanted beings who would choose to love Him, who would choose to worship Him, who would choose to serve Him. That's who God made us. Next, God designed the man to represent Him by bearing His image as a male, or as the Hebrew word, and we're going to look at this next time, the word is zakar. And the word zakar has to do with power, it has to do with strength, it has to do with forward movement that brings life. He designed us to represent Him and to image Him in that way. Not only that, God then took the man and He placed the man in His own Edenic garden, his home, the temple where man was made to worship Him, where man was made to serve Him. But Eden was surrounded by a good but undeveloped, chaotic, untamed world. In other words, all the world wasn't idyllic. It was good, but it wasn't perfect. Eden was perfect, but God didn't create a perfect world. He created a good world that needed to be what? Developed and perfected. God then gave the man a mandate to extend the glory that's in Eden out into the world. In other words, take all the goodness that's in Eden, the perfection and glory of me, where I live in Eden, and begin to expand it out into the world. And you do it by subduing it, you do it by developing it, you do it by taming it. That's the mission that God gave to men. And then God intended the man to turn the world into a place of Edenic order and beauty and life for the flourishing of human beings. As man extended outward, the glory would go outward, order, beauty, and life, and also what? The human race would grow and develop and extend, and all the world would come to know that God is the Creator and worthy of praise and worship. That was God's plan. Now, from this creation story, we can draw 5 realities about manhood. First, manhood is part of the good creation order. It's not something bad. To be a man is not bad, it's good. Men exist under the authority and rule of God, expressed through dependence, submission, worship, and service. That is all a good thing. It's good to be a man. Second, we have a unique design. Men are zakar. It's the Hebrew word, and I'll tell you what that means next time. But it's the word zakar, male image bearers, designed to reflect God's chaos-taming, life-giving power. That's why men are drawn to strength and power. Why? Because there's something about us that was designed to reflect not our power, but the power that God gives us to reflect Him, that creates order, beauty, and life, that tames chaos. Third, we have a distinct function as men. Men have been assigned uniquely male tasks that perfectly fit their unique masculine design. In other words, God made the man to fit the task. He didn't fit the task and then because the man was like this. God had a task for you and me, and He created and shaped us so that we could accomplish His task. The one that He assigned to men. He assigned others to women, but He assigned certain tasks and functions to you and me. Being a man has purpose, where it's purposeful in scope. Men are called to subdue an untamed world in order to create good environments for human flourishing. That's what men are for. That's our purpose. We have power of agency. What do I mean by that? Men have the freedom to choose to live under God's rule and in accord with their God-given design, purpose, and function. The world needs men who choose to live under God's rule like that. But unfortunately, we live in a world where men have chosen not to live like that. And that's the freedom God gives to you and I as men. But I also want you to see one more thing. Manhood is transcendent in nature. In other words, it's not a cultural construct. It's not just a social way of thinking about this kind of a being that has this biology. Why do I say that? Because manhood is tied to the creation order. The manly standard that we're going to look at transcends time and culture. Now, it may, on the outward appearances, look different, what the manly standard in each culture, but at the core, guess what it's going to be? All the same. All the same. Why? Because masculinity and the manhood standard is part of the creation order, and it therefore transcends time, and it transcends culture. Now, using these realities from the creation story, let me offer a definition of what it means to be a man. So, what is a man? Let's try it. Here we go. A man is an adult human male image bearer, created by God and responsible to God. You cannot reflect the God that you've been created and designed to reflect unless you are living in submission to Him. And why did He make us like this? For advancing God's good purposes for human flourishing. How? By reflecting through words and actions God's creative power that brings order, beauty, and life to a chaotic world. In the days to come, I want to kind of shorten that so it's a little bit more short and pithy, but I wanted you to see this because this incorporates Genesis 1 and 2. This is a standard that we can begin to look at. So what is a man? A man is an adult human male image bearer created by God and responsible to God for advancing God's good purposes for human flourishing. How? By reflecting through his words and actions God's creative power that brings order, beauty, and life to the chaos of his world. That's a man. Now, one final note. This is going to be our working definition, but let me just add this. It needs to be further developed and shaped and formed. And so this is, we're going to look at the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2 because we want this to be accurate. Okay? We want to look specifically at Genesis 1 and 2 to see what it says about manhood. Second, it needs to be more fully explained. And we need to do that so that we have a good sense of the biblical standard for manhood. We want it to be solid in your mind and in my mind. Why? So that when the Bible tells us to act like men, we know what it means to act like men, and we know what it means what? Not to act like men. And so then we also then want to begin to practically apply it. What will this look like for you and me in this chaotic world that needs men of moral clarity and courage and resolve? What will it look like for you and me to speak and move into the chaos to reflect the power of God that brings order and beauty and life to the chaos? That's the biblical command. And we want to do that because we want to obey God. Why? because God deserves it. God is worth it. He's worthy, not just of our worship, but He's worthy that we should live the way He's created us to live and calls us to live. And how does He call us to live? How does He call us to be? He calls us to act like men. And we're going to do this over the next several meetings. And again, why are we doing this, guys? Well, one reason. The world is falling apart. And the world needs men who act like men. They need you and it needs me. The world needs you and me to act like men. Men of moral clarity, men of moral courage, men of moral resolve, men who love God and are committed to fulfilling the responsibilities by living out our design as male image bearers. That's what I want for my life more than anything else. And that's what I want for you more than anything else. This is key to growing in our Christianity. Because we don't grow in our Christianity and our spirituality just as people who happen to be men. We grow in our spirituality and our Christianity and our spiritual development as men made in the image of God. Our masculinity grows and develops along with everything else. Why? Because you can't separate who you are from your male body and your male soul. You are, as well as I am, an embodied soul that is a man. So we'll stop there, and next time, November 11th, which is good because 4 days later is hunting season, and I'm hoping to go hunting again this year. But we will look at Session 3, and it will be the origin story of men. And what we're going to see in Genesis 1 and 2 is this: God made men to be like Him. God made you to be like Him. That's what we're going to see. So until then, thanks for coming. And we're going to let the internet go right now. And if you need to leave, feel free to leave. If you have any questions,